The Vietnam War was a long and costly conflict. It pitted the communist government of North Vietnam and its southern allies, the Viet Cong, against the government of South Vietnam and its principal ally, the United States. The war began in 1954 after the First Indochina War and ended in 1975 with the fall of Saigon. The Vietnam War was a proxy war, part of the larger Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States supported South Vietnam to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. The Soviet Union and China supported North Vietnam to promote communism. The war divided the American people and led to widespread protests. It left Vietnam devastated and divided. Understanding the war's origins, key moments and legacy is essential to grasp its significance. The war continues to shape US-Vietnam relations and influences US foreign policy today. To understand the Vietnam War, we must look back at Vietnam's history. For centuries, Vietnam struggled for independence, fighting against Chinese domination and later French colonialism. France's control over Vietnam began in the mid-1800s, aiming to exploit Vietnam's resources and strategic location. In the early 20th century, Vietnamese nationalism grew, with leaders like Ho Chi Minh seeking independence. After World War II, France tried to reassert control over Vietnam, igniting the First Indochina War from 1946 to 1954. The Viet Minh's victory at Dien Bien Phu in 1954 forced France to negotiate a peace agreement at the Geneva Conference. Vietnam was temporarily divided along the 17th parallel, with the north controlled by Ho Chi Minh's communist forces and the south under Ngo Dinh Diem, an anti-communist. The United States played a significant role in the Vietnam War. Initially, US involvement was limited to providing military advisors and aid to South Vietnam. The US government, under President Dwight D. Eisenhower, subscribed to the domino theory, which posited that if one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, others would follow. As the conflict intensified, US involvement escalated under President John F. Kennedy, who increased the number of military advisors in South Vietnam and authorized the use of defoliants like Agent Orange. The situation further escalated under President Lyndon B. Johnson. In August 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred, involving alleged attacks on US Navy destroyers by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. The incident, although controversial, provided the Johnson administration with the pretext for direct military intervention in Vietnam. The US Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, granting President Johnson broad war powers. This marked a turning point, leading to a sustained bombing campaign against North Vietnam and the deployment of ground troops to South Vietnam in large numbers. This marked the beginning of America's full-fledged involvement in the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War was fought on multiple fronts, taking a heavy toll on both sides. The NVA and VC were formidable adversaries, using their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. US and South Vietnamese forces relied heavily on air power and firepower. The Tet Offensive in January 1968 was a series of surprise attacks on major cities. It shook the confidence of the American public and government. The Tet Offensive is seen as a turning point, eroding public support for the war. As the Vietnam War dragged on, opposition to the war grew within the United States. The anti-war movement was fueled by the growing number of American casualties, the draft, and the horrific images of the war being broadcast into American homes on television. The movement drew support from students, civil rights activists, and even some disillusioned veterans. Protests against the war took many forms, including teach-ins, demonstrations, and acts of civil disobedience. The anti-war movement became increasingly vocal and visible, putting immense pressure on the US government to end the war. One of the most significant events that fueled the anti-war movement was the My Lai massacre. In March 1968, US Army soldiers killed hundreds of unarmed Vietnamese civilians in the village of My Lai. The massacre, initially covered up by the US Army, shocked the American public when it was revealed in 1969. It became a symbol of the brutality and moral quagmire of the Vietnam War, further eroding public support for the war. The anti-war movement played a critical role in shaping public opinion and ultimately contributed to the decision to withdraw US troops from Vietnam. By the late 1960s, the Johnson administration was under immense pressure to end the Vietnam War. Public support for the war had dwindled, and the anti-war movement was gaining momentum. In 1968, President Johnson announced that he would not seek re-election and pledged to pursue peace negotiations with North Vietnam. Peace talks began in Paris in 1968 and dragged on for several years, fraught with obstacles and disagreements over the terms of a ceasefire and the future of South Vietnam. In 1972, President Richard Nixon ordered the Christmas bombings, a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam, to force them to negotiate seriously. The bombings were highly controversial, but succeeded in bringing North Vietnam back to the negotiating table. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Accords were signed, including a ceasefire agreement, the withdrawal of US troops from Vietnam, and the release of American prisoners of war. However, the accords did not resolve the fundamental political issues at the heart of the conflict, leaving the future of South Vietnam uncertain. The Paris Peace Accords proved to be a fragile peace. Fighting between North and South Vietnam resumed almost immediately. The North Vietnamese government, emboldened by the withdrawal of US troops, launched a massive offensive in 1975. The South Vietnamese army, weakened by corruption and low morale, was unable to resist the North Vietnamese onslaught. As North Vietnamese forces advanced on Saigon, the US government organized a massive evacuation of American citizens and Vietnamese collaborators. The evacuation, known as Operation Frequent Wind, was chaotic and heartbreaking, leaving thousands of Vietnamese behind. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, marking the end of the Vietnam War. The fall of Saigon marked the end of an era, sending shockwaves throughout the world and leaving a profound impact on the United States and Vietnam. The Vietnam War had a profound impact on American society, leaving lasting scars on the nation's psyche. The war divided the American people, eroded trust in the government, and raised questions about the morality of US foreign policy. The war also had a significant economic impact, contributing to inflation and economic instability. Many veterans returned home with physical and psychological wounds, facing difficulty reintegrating into civilian life and stigma. The war led to a decline in public trust in the government and the military, with events like the My Lai massacre tarnishing the image of the US military. The Vietnam War had a lasting impact on US foreign policy, making the United States more reluctant to intervene militarily in foreign conflicts and emphasizing diplomacy and multilateralism. The legacy of the Vietnam War continues to be debated and discussed today, serving as a reminder of the costs of war and the importance of carefully considering the consequences of military intervention. After the war, Vietnam faced the daunting task of rebuilding and reunifying a nation shattered by decades of conflict. The country was devastated, its economy in ruins, and millions of people displaced or having lost loved ones. The communist government of North Vietnam imposed its rule on the South, leading to political repression and economic hardship. Despite these challenges, Vietnam has made remarkable progress in the decades since the war. The country adopted a policy of Doi Moi renovation in 1986, introducing economic reforms that led to significant growth and development. Vietnam has transformed from one of the poorest countries in the world to a lower middle-income country. Vietnam has also made strides in its foreign relations, normalizing relations with the United States in 1995 and becoming an active member of ASEAN. Vietnam continues to face challenges, including poverty, inequality and corruption, but its resilience and commitment to development offer hope for a brighter future. The Vietnam War was a pivotal event of the 20th century, shaping the world today. It had a profound impact on the United States, Vietnam, and the international community. The war highlighted the complexities of Cold War geopolitics and ideological conflicts. It also influenced military strategy, leading to new technologies and doctrines. The Vietnam War remains a subject of study and debate, with its legacies still felt today. It serves as a cautionary tale about the limits of military power and the importance of understanding other cultures. The war reminds us of the importance of diplomacy and mutual understanding in resolving disputes. The lessons of the Vietnam War remain relevant as we navigate a complex world. It is essential to remember the sacrifices of those who fought in the war. We must also honor the resilience of the Vietnamese people who have rebuilt their country.